Dahlia led the way up the ladder carved into the Bengkot tree. Wirt followed several rungs below. He paused, looking around, noting the dozens of tall women spider creatures watching them feebly climb upwards. Dahlia made it onto one of the main causeway branches and waited for him. Quite a view from up here, isn't it? Wirt stood up and looked out through a gap in the canopy. Impressive radiation-absorbing qualities. He looked over at her. You carved that ladder yourself? She shook her head. No, they did it for me. She brushed her hair out of her face and redid the bindings. We came to terms that I can't climb like them. I gave them a couple blades I had and they do that for me. Wirt knelt down and touched the upper rung cut into the thick bark. HFY giving them weaponry? Dahlia laughed. You ever eat crab? Wirt thought for a moment and looked up at a female crawling down the tree. Pressure-based warfare. Knives are about as useful to them as spoons are to you. She nodded. Bingo ringo. She stood up and started walking along the worn line on the branch. I tried all several tactics. She looked back for a moment, meeting his eyes. Thrown stones don't affect the local fauna here, even at height, so they never adapted to throwing. Trajectories and the visual requirements just don't click with them. Poor shots, then, Wirt said. She nodded, her hands moving as she walked and talked. Yeah, tried bows and arrows. Wirt noted the unstrung bow on her back. Kept one for yourself, though, despite it being useless? Hunting other humans? Nah, not useless at all. I mean, piercing is, but I found a couple chemical compounds that are interesting. Wirt kept pace with her, periodically scanning as the xenoarchs utilized tethers to make their way across the treetops. Go on? Turns out citric acid gets them high. Hallucinations, all that kind of stuff. I've been doing experiments with it. She looked back at him again. There's also a native parasitic worm, grows in shellfish. It's a painkiller in extremely small doses, but anything more than a dot and it'll lead to respiratory failure. Poison arrows? She nodded again. Yeah, still useless for them, though. Can't aim, but I'm working on a practical application for them. Queen of the jungle, eh? She laughed. That's Alexandra. I'm just trying to foster trade. They'd be piss shots with firearms, too. He smiled back at her. Hand-to-hand combat would afflict them as well. I got antidote pills made up. With proper planning, we could make something work. Wirt thought for a moment, his eyes set to watching her feet as she made her way on the trail. A whip, wider, able to be soaked in the fluid. Net-like, maybe a towel of sorts with a handle to minimize contact with the chemical. She nodded her head slightly, looking over her shoulder at him. They could do that pretty easy. He looked down at the branch as they crossed over into another tree. Yeah, they wouldn't have to buy the weapon, but rather the cure. He looked back up at her. You don't have a problem instigating violence amongst them? Not instigating, utilizing. They already do it, and the presence of the prisoners was already causing an imbalance, destabilizing the region. She pointed up toward a woven rectangle up ahead. My lab. Wirt smiled as they got closer. Mother Gorpal was waiting at the entrance. Finally, you have come. Her rectangle translated for Dahlia. Slow as ever, apprentice. Wirt noted the vibrations dampening as the reverberations neared the mother's foot. He met 3 of her eyes as they looked back at him. Your people are quite interesting. Gorpal stepped aside as they entered. I think your people are the interesting ones. Dahlia went over to a crude stick and string table and took her tablet off of it. She stared into it as she walked over toward Wirt. I've got everything open here. Feel free to look over it. Let me know your offer. Wirt took it in hand and began scrolling through the data folders. You have quite the species collection here. He touched one file and opened it up. What is this one? They call them shetalf. It just means edible flying creature. She looked closer at it. Carapace is thinner on them, allows for better lift. I don't know aerodynamics that well, but it moves like birds I've grown back home. What's this species eat? Dahlia grimaced slightly. I've dissected a few of them. Their bellies are usually filled with internal fluids. I think they use their pointed mandibles to get at the seams in larger creatures, suck juices out. Large mosquitoes, Wirt said, nodding. I'm not familiar with that species. she said. I'm guessing parasitic? Wirt laughed. You truly are foreign to your own species. He looked up at her. You're wanting to make your own zoo, a preserve of your own. She nodded. You're not a preserver. She looked down slightly. Not exactly human either. He looked over at Mother Gorpol. She is not of the tall women either, is she? Gorpol darkened her eyes. She is learning, but she will never have a clutch. That is true. Dahlia looked at him. What's your people like? I've seen a few, but you're all so guarded. Wirt met her eyes, his face neutral. That is a hard question. We're as different as anything can be. Each of us is a being of capability and thought bound in form, in that we are all in common. Those thoughts, forms, and capabilities are as numerous as the stars themselves, though. He looked back down at the data slate. I come from a lineage, chose them more like we, my cohorts and I, serve an idea. She watched him as he thought. He took a long breath, sucking in air before continuing. We all acknowledge the true nihilistic nature of the universe, but my people are imposing our own purpose into the void. We are neo-evolutionists in a way. He scrolled through the data some more, looking over the blood samples of several large herbivores. Rather than waiting for chemistry and genes to adapt to environments, we go into new environments and sample everything there, and then, with sufficient knowledge, we create a new iteration of ourselves to survive there. So, you're going to make something from that? She pointed at her tablet. Wirt looked up at her, then over toward Gorpol. You two might not realize it, but all our visions are aligned. He stood up straighter, his feet feeling the xenoarcs in proximity. Your people are hungry, at the verge of seeing the truth about the universe, and actually comprehending it. He looked back at Dahlia. You, preserver-trained, yet yearn to be human. Your purposes mesh well with my own. Gorpol widened her eyes and matched his height. I do not understand like you think. I want my nest to flourish. I want my allies to flourish. And I want my enemies to wither. He raised a finger. Strike that last part, and we are on the same page. Dahlia bit her lip for a moment and shook her hands free. You like my data. You're liking this world. Wirt stared at her. I want a proper setup, station, ship somewhere. I want to start a preservatory. She said, meeting his gaze. You can afford it, I'm sure of it. You probably have facilities dormant all over the galaxies. He smiled. Humans, while fond of history, are more apt at creating history than just recording it. He pointed at her. Help me create, and you have a deal. She took a breath, calming down slightly. Give me details. Bubba had his still out, running his native wine through it. Kurt sat beside it, dangling his feet off the back porch, watching as swimming worms swam in his shadow. Jacob stood with the jar under the drip spout. Michael, get yours ready, he said, pulling his out as it was near full. Michael put his under the drip and stood, waiting for it to fill. Jacobs looked over at Bubba. How's the temp? Bubba crouched, looking at the gauge. Still right in the money, still good. You want to rerun this? Bubba looked up at him and reached his hand for the jar. Jacobs handed it over and Bubba took a sip. Ooh, nah, bud, that's stout enough as it is. He stood up and looked around at the men. Kurt, try it. Kurt accepted the offered jar and took a sip. Bit hairier already. He looked over at the spider nearby. Your buddies want some? Bubba looked over at Puzdot. Want to try some shine? Puzdot stepped over and leaned over the jar, sniffing it. His eyes darkened and he shook his head toward Bubba. I do not like that. The nearby orb translated. Kurt motioned with the jar. Take a sip, bud. It'll help loosen you up. Bubba laughed slightly. Alcohol doesn't get them drunk. Kurt looked over at him. What's it do to them? They can process it. I guess just another sweet to them. Kurt looked back over at Puzdot. Why don't you want any then? Smells like filth, Puzdot replied. Kurt nodded. Yeah, it really does, he said before taking another sip. Michael looked up from the drip toward Bubba. How long your girlfriend going to be, Bubba? Bubba chuckled, shaking his hand up. Nah, that Dahlia woo. You can try her if you want. Michael shook his head. Nope, I tried talking to her a few times in town. Rambles too much. Kurt shivered as he took his third sip. I'll be ready to listen to her in another couple sips. He looked over at Bubba. Want to throw dice, Bubs? Bubba groaned. I kinda like what I got. He took a step towards him. Don't need to be losing my boat to you guys. Kurt laughed and handed the jar back up to him. That doesn't sound like the Bubba I remember. He'd be wanting to win mine off me. Jacobs walked over toward the corner post, watching 3 Xenoarch males fishing off a stump across the lagoon. What you'll think about this factory thing it's wanting to make? Bubba took a sip from the jar, shivering as he felt it go down. I think it's a bad idea. Jacobs nodded and looked around at the other 2 men. I agree about that, he said, letting it hang in the air. Do we want to do something about it? Michael tilted his jar as it was nearing the top line. What can we do about it? Doubt we could hurt it. Puzdot walked sideways up to Bubba. You're talking about the quiet one? Bubba nodded. Yeah, Wirt. You do not trust him? Not in the slightest, Puss. Why? Puzdot asked. Bubba let out a sigh before taking another sip. He let the heat go down his throat before replying. His kind have no morals. They're murderers, mutilators. They've wiped out cities, people for no reason. They're monsters if I've ever seen one. Pustet widened his eyes, bowing slightly. He seems to have reasons for what he is doing. Michael shook his head slowly. Not any that make sense. Puzdot pivoted his eyes onto the 4 men. You are all captured here on my world. Bubba looked around at the guys and back toward Puzdot. Yeah, we're imprisoned here. Puzdot chittered. That makes no sense. Are you food? Are there things keeping you here to grow, feeding you my people to make you fat? Others say so, but I think it is punishment. They say if being punished, why are your bodies intact? It makes no sense. Bubba took another sip, nodding into the jar. Yeah, he said. We think people can atone for things, and if not, we put them in a place where they wouldn't commit any more harm. Pustot chittered more. Eat your head then, and you would not do harm. Easy, less expenses, less resources, less damage. Kurt pivoted, putting a leg up on the porch as he looked over at Puzdot. Nah, little bud, you don't get it. We don't do that, think like that even. That's barbaric. Our people are past that. And maybe the quiet one, Wirt, is past what you are capable of reasoning. Bubba laughed. He likes to talk like he is, but he ain't. Puzdot focused on Bubba. You are our Yaga, yet the mothers know you are not as powerful as your wife or this Wirt. It is obvious to them as it is obvious when the day is. Your mentality is weak compared to them, yet you are thinking you are smarter than them. Is this the root of your banishment? Your people think your mind is weak and put you somewhere where you could not harm them, and in turn you harmed my people? Kurt raised his eyebrows, looking at Bubba. Damn, he's got a point. Bubba stared at Puzdot for a moment. You're smarter than I figured, Puss. Puzdot stood taller, widening his eyes. Tight Clasp always hated my thoughts. She has liked the intelligence of our daughters, though. They will be named soon, and I think they will be mothers given a few seasons. Michael looked over at the gauge. You watching the temp, Bubba? Bubba took another sip and shook his head. Nope. Michael craned his neck looking down at it, letting several drips fall to the porch. It's running hot. Bubba motioned with the jar. Then let it go. Just moisture coming out now then. I didn't want tails in mine, Bub. Damn it. Bubba laughed. Kurt, you got dice on you? Kurt nodded. Hell yeah, old Bubba's coming back, eh? Bubba looked over at Jacobs. You in? Jacobs nodded and pulled off his shirt, putting it down on the porch. 7s over 11s? 10s over, Bubba replied. Keep the odds closer. Michael took a sip of his jar and turned down the burner. 9s, we need some spice. Kurt scooted over and looked at Bubba as the man sat across the shirt from him. Wagers in boys. Bubba looked back at him and sat the jar down. Wins a sip. He looked over at Puzdot as the male scooted close to the cloth. You in Puss? In what? Kurt threw out a pair of dice, letting them roll across the shirt. Rolling dice, Puss. Oldest game humans know. Game of chance, game of winning and losing. Just have to put up a wager. Poosdot gave them the human nod. This is the gambling. Bubba nodded back at him. Yup. He turned his 4 eyes on Bubba. This is the thing that got you in trouble? Got you banished here with us? Bubba groaned. Cards were my forte, but yeah, pretty much. And still you wish to partake of it? Even though your people do not like you doing it? Bubba shifted on his legs to stare at the male. Everything in moderation, Puss. I haven't gambled in a long time. I figure I might play a little. Pussdot looked at the dice on the shirt. Show me, teach me, and I may play. Kurt smiled. You gotta wager first. Pussdot looked at the man with all 4 eyes. I will offer 1 weave. And your offer? Kurt pointed at his craft at the far end of the porch. 1 weave versus 2 fish. Poosdot listened to the translation. Meat is good offer. Go on. Kurt handed the dice over, opening Poosdot's hand to accept them. Roll them on the shirt. 3 rolls, get a 9 you win and get another 3. Roll an 11 you lose and it's my roll. Pussdot moved the cubes in his hand, looking at the dots and sides. Those odds are in my favor. You will lose your meat. Kurt nodded. Yeah, exactly. Go on then, bud. What happens if I don't get either? My roll. Pussdot's eyes widened. Ah, odds are a shift in turn. Interesting. Winning begets winning, but the odds are you will shift turns going. He thought for a moment. So this is just a means of wealth transfer. He looked over at Bubba. You did this to transfer all your wealth? Bubba sighed. It's about luck. Testing if fate is with your or against you, Puss. That's what gambling is. Pussdot looked down at the shirt and rolled, landing a 7. I go again. He picked them up quickly and rolled again, getting 2 2s. I roll again. He scooped them up again and felt them. I can shift them in my hand? Kurt laughed. Yeah, how else you going to roll them? Poosdot nodded at him. You have agreed. He threw the dice back out, landing a 9. You give me the promised meat. Kurt looked down at the dice and back up at him. I'll give you 4 if you can do that again. Pussdot looked at the dice and scooped them back up. You will give me 4 yigwin? Fish, yeah. Roll another 9 and I'll double what I offered. Pussdot felt the dice in his hand and rolled, landing a 5 and 4. You owe me 4. Bubba laughed. Kurt, were you going to play me with weighted? Kurt's eyes were wide. No, those are legit. Michael took a sip of his jar, shaking as it went down. Do it again, Puss. Pussdot looked at him. What wealth do you offer? Michael laughed. I don't have shit with me. I just wanted to see 3 in a row. Pussdot looked him over, his 4 eyes scanning over the man's body. The weaves you wear on your upper body. Michael stared back. My shirt? Pussdot nodded. Yes, I'll do it for your shirt. Michael looked over at Bubba. So it's like a gimmick? Bubba shrugged. I don't know. I've never gambled with him. He laughed and took another sip. Fuck it, offer it up. I want to see it too. What the hell, all right. Michael unbuttoned his shirt and put it next to the one on the porch. Do it again, Puss. Puss nodded again, exaggerating the gesture. He cupped his hand, manipulating the dice in it with the pads in his palm. He threw them forward, watching them roll. Again, they landed on a 5 and a 4. Michael laughed. Fucking awesome. You can do that shit on command? He looked at Kurt. You know they could do that? Kurt shook his head. Nope. I'm out the fish I caught, though. He looked over at Bubba. We train him a bit, keep this shit under wraps, and we could clean out the mayor. Bubba's eyes grew wider, and he looked at the other 3 men. That guy's shit in a box of chocolate. He won't gamble with me again, though. Kurt thought for a moment and lifted the jar off the porch, taking a sip. I can do it. Jacobs nodded. Wipe out that debt you owe in a throw. I like it. Poosdot split his attention across the group. You want me to give me more wealth? Bubba shifted on his legs, moving one around so he could face Pussdot better. Gambling isn't all just luck, as you are obviously showing us. He lifted a finger up. A good chunk of gambling is knowing the players and being skilled in deception. Pussdot shrank into himself slightly. Humans are good at deception. Your eyes are better. But you feel more, Bubba said. Properly done, we can play this out, make a killing. Pusdot chittered. I will help you kill the mayor. Kurt snorted. Fuck. You're badass puss. Bubba waved his finger a bit while shaking his head. Another saying. We don't really want to kill that fish fucker, just clean him out. Another phrase. Or do you want to clean him before we steal his wealth? Jacobs groaned. Throw whatever he wants, but he ain't going to pull off anything more than a few tricks. Nobody's going to fall for anything big. Bubba scooted back and leaned against the porch post, pulling another sip off the jar. Fuck, yeah, you can lie, puss. Hold back, throw off wins. You get that, don't you? Pusdot rose up slightly, focusing on his friend. That is something I know. He looked around at the men and spoke, quieter. The females. They will devour all given or make a mess with it. We have to mete out their feasts so we may eat as well. He focused back on Bubba. I can deceive when needed. Bubba looked over at Jacobs. We got time before the robot gets back with her. Want to practice with him? Role play some? Jacobs moved over next Tata's shirt on the porch, lifting up Michael's. He threw it over toward Pusdot. Let's do it. I hate that asshole too. He pointed at the dice. I'm going first. Show him what it looks like to lose. He laughed and grabbed the dice, quickly rolling out snake eyes. We have not offered wealth, the Xenoarch stated. Kurt pointed toward Pusdot, his hand wavering in the air. You got 4 fish you can bet. You haven't given them to me yet. Kurt nodded, smiling. They are as good as yours. You're free to bet with them. Pusdot mimed the nod back. Currency. Bubba smiled. Alexandra made her way down the woven bridge to the roof of her house. She stepped slowly across the tin, her bare feet helping her balance. Mother Darkness kept pace with her. Darkness pivoted an eye toward her. Your males are inebriated and talking with my son. Alexandra nodded. Yeah, I hear him over there. Dahlia back yet? Darkness darkened her eyes slightly, keeping her posture high. No. She is coming back with the quiet one on the branch road. She will be here before sun sets 3 fingers. Alexandra paused and looked up at the sky. She lifted her hand up toward the sun. She looked over at Darkness, gauging the size of her hand. My full hand, then. Okay, that's what an hour, I think. Hour, Darkness repeated in the human tongue. Hour, that is a weird word to say. Feels funny in my air. Alexandra smiled and started walking down toward the edge of the roof. Yeah, I feel that way trying any of your words. My lips can't make those sounds. Darkness watched her as she looked over the edge. The ladder we made is over there. Alexandra smiled back at her and slipped her dress over her head. Hold this. Darkness took the clothing in her lower right hand, still focused on the woman. What are you doing? You are giving me this? Alexandra took a breath. Just for a moment. Meet me on the porch. Darkness moved her arms in the discomfort of the confusion. I don't understand. Alexandra looked back over, taking another deep breath, and jumped into the murky water. Mother Darkness's eyes darkened as she quickly made her way to the edge of the tin roof. Alexandra, she said. Queen Alexandra! Bubba heard the splash and looked around at his friends. He then heard Darkness shouting his wife's name. Oh shit! Kurt pointed over toward the water. How deep is it there? Bubba followed his hand as he thought. I think 12, maybe 20. Kurt bobbed his head slightly. She'll be fine then. Did a dive. Bubba started getting up when he heard a slight movement in the water off to his right. He leaned over, looking down to see Alexandra smiling up at him. Sup, drunkie, she said, laughing. Get up here, he said with a sigh. She swam over to the ladder and started climbing up. She reached the top and stepped onto the porch, dripping her way over to the gamblers. She noted Pusdot throwing dice and his sons gathered behind him watching. Teaching them bad habits, bub? Bubba laughed. Teaching him some good ones, Lexi. He looked her over as she shook her hair. Benny, inside, you know the towels? Benny, one of Pusdot's twins, got up, his eyes widening. He turned and went into the house. Alexandra watched the Xenoarch for a moment, and then turned toward the men. I don't like calling them tall women. Jacobs looked up at her, his eyes watery and unable to focus on her. That's their species name. That's what they like to be called. Gotta respect that. She shook her head. Benny's a male. Doesn't feel right. Bubba laughed. And you're a member of mankind. Alexandra rolled her eyes and sat down next to him. Give me sip of that. Bubba pushed the quarter-full jar over and she picked it up. She took a mouthful, tilting her head back, forcing it down. You've made stronger. I know, but it's strong enough, her husband replied. He looked her over, smiling. Dahlia with you? Poosdot shook his head. She is coming. Be here shortly. Kurt tried standing up, stumbling back onto his hands. Shit! I need to get the boat ready. Bubba groaned and turned, looking back toward his own boat. Damn, I figured it'd take them longer. Alexandra laughed. To download files? That takes next to no time. Longest part is the hike. Bubba looked down at his hands. Lexi, you want to drive? She shook her head. Nope. I'm a queen, you gotta drive me around. I can't drive like this. He looked over at Poosdot. Puss, can you drive? Puzdot pivoted his eyes around and settled on Bubba and Alexandra. Your craft is terrifying. I would be scared to be in control of it. Bubba laughed, waving him off with his hand. Go slow then. We'll be right there with you. Kurt sighed. What about my boat? Darkness stepped down the post behind the man. I will drive it. Kurt flinched and looked up at her, her lower hands just above his head. Shit. You can drive? If my son can drive, I can drive. The rectangle hanging around her neck translated. I will drive the craft to the human nest. Kurt scooted a bit away from her, still staring at her. Mine isn't like Bubba's. It hovers. I am aware human male. I will learn. It is necessary for me to learn. Pusdot looked over at his mother, bowing slightly. You wish to drive the one that sits on the water? She flashed the dark of her eyes at him. No, the quiet one will be on that craft. I will drive it. Alexandra looked over at Bubba. Maybe we should wait until tomorrow. There's no rush. Bubba stood up, wavering slightly. Nah, let them do it. She's right. They need to learn. No, they don't, Alexandra said, half laughing. They got their trails they can take. They don't need boats. There is no reason for them to learn them things. Bubba shook his head. Nope, you're wrong. He looked over at Poosdot. I miss getting ripped. If he learns to drive, then I can retire and just do the fishing. Poosdot nodded toward Alexandra. He is better at fishing than I am. This would be beneficial to us. Darkness took a step towards Alexandra, careful to keep her posture lower than the woman. I do not mean offense, but I want my people to learn more of your ways. These magic things of science, we need to learn if we are to progress. Dahlia, Alexandra said with a groan. All right, if you think you can. She put her hand up. We'll go slow and follow each other. Keep things safe as we can. Jacob stood up trying to balance himself, but accidentally knocked the empty jar off the edge of the porch. Life jackets. Make sure everyone wears one so we don't drown. Michael groaned. I'll go dig them out. He then started crawling down the porch on his hands and knees. Fucking hell. He paused and moved over to the edge of the porch and threw up into the water. A swarm of iguan flurried around, picking at the puke particles. The vehicles were loaded, and everyone was aboard and waiting as Dahlia and Wirt made their way down the woven ladders. Dahlia stepped to the edge and looked at the party on the hovercraft. You all been waiting long? Kurt looked over at Mother Darkness and then up at Dahlia, grinning wide. Not at all, love. Come on aboard. She looked over at Wirt. He nodded at her and she went ahead and crawled aboard. Our country excursion is on hiatus then. Wirt looked over at the tall women aboard the craft with Bubba and Alexandra, the middle-aged male at the help of the craft. He then looked at Kurt. You are all drunk. Jacobs laughed and hit Michael in the shoulder. Told you. Kurt raised his hand up. We're all good. Just teaching the lady how to drive is all. I paid you to ferry me. He looked over at Darkness. Her motions are infantile. She doesn't know how to operate this craft. You are putting our lives in danger. Kurt reached over and tossed him a life vest. We got ours on. You'll be fine. Wirt shut his eyes for a moment to run simulations. Her depth perception is limited, he said, eyes still closed. Kurt nodded, still smiling. Yup, makes it fun? Jacobs pulled the rope off the porch and looked up at Wirt with his hand outstretched. We're going back slow. We're not in a rush. Wirt opened his eyes and looked down at the human. Jacob smiled at him. Think of it as a pleasure cruise. My work I needed to do here is complete. I now have things I need to tend to back at Birmingham. I was hoping to get there in speed. Kurt groaned and patted Darkness on the leg. Well, you'll have to talk to the driver. We'll go as fast as she can. He looked up and smiled at her with a wink. No faster than you're comfortable, though. Mother Darkness kept 2 eyes on his hand as he withdrew it and focused the other 2 on Wirt. Your vision is more than capable, Quiet One. Sit next to me and be my guide. Wirt stepped down the water-slick ladder and got onto the craft. He looked over the drunken crew and then focused on the Xenoarch pilot. I didn't pay you, Mother. I paid them to be my crew. This is unprofessional. Jacobs laughed. Yes, we're unprofessional. Us, the inmates. He leaned over and swung at Michael. Michael caught his hand and moved it down. We've just been socializing. Lost track of time. He looked over at Kurt. We thought you'd be longer. Wirt looked at Dahlia as he sat down. It's either this or let them sleep it off. Dahlia wiggled into her life jacket and looked over at Darkness. I'm ready if y'all are, she smiled. It may be fun. Wirt shut his eyes to calculate again. We can take the common route Bubba has scored through the swamp. It's wider and easily navigable. He opened his eyes and looked the pilot over, pointing out toward the gap in the trees. Make for the middle. Take it slow. Darkness widened her eyes and tapped the throttle forward. The craft lunged slightly, causing her to adjust. Her hands moved over the steering levers and she angled out away from the house. 2 more lunges and she found a stable, slow forward motion. Bubba shouted from the boat behind the craft. Kurt! Kurt looked over the lip of the craft and put his hands out, catching the remnant jar just as it touched the water. He smiled back at Bubba as he lifted the jar up. Got it! Bubba put a thumb up and lifted another full jar, winking at his friend. Let me know when it's gone. Kurt winked back and popped the top off before taking another slug of shine. Wirt watched the interaction, hiding his indignation from his outward expression algorithms.